Today I am bringing you my October reading wrap up, which is a little bit late. I'm filming this halfway through November, so I am very late with doing this wrap up. However, in October I read 9 books in total and I vlogged every single book that I read. So if you do want my fresh thoughts as I was reading any of these books, then I will leave various reading vlogs linked in the description, or you can just check them out on my channel. But yeah, I wanted to do a wrap up anyway because I know that some people don't like watching reading vlogs. So we're going to get into the video. I haven't put these books in any particular order. I think we're just going to go in the order that I read them. So starting with The Reformatory by Tanana Reeve Due. This was the first book that I finished in October and I gave this 5 stars. In fact, something that I wanted to mention is I had several 5 stars in October. It was a really great reading month and 2 of the books I think are going to make it onto my best books of the year list. This is one of them. It was such an incredibly impactful book. It's the kind of book that I think is going to stick with me for a really long time. I would describe this as historical fiction with some paranormal and horror elements. It's often described as just straight up horror, and I agree because there are certain elements in this that are truly horrifying. However, I also think that it lent more historical. It has the pacing of a historical fiction, in my opinion. It's set in the 1950s in Florida and we're following 2 siblings. The first is a 12-year-old boy called Robert, and at the start of this book he is sent to a prison that calls itself a school, but he's sent to this place called the Reformatory because he kicks a white boy. He does this while defending his sister, and you do also get the perspective of his sister who is desperately trying to free him from this situation, and I thought this was so compelling. It is a little bit slow, especially in the beginning. However, it's not like slow in a bad way. I think it just takes its time to set the atmosphere and to make you feel invested in these characters. Throughout this entire book I felt anxious, I felt heartbroken, I felt so many emotions, and this is not just a ghost story. This reformatory that this young boy is sent to is haunted by boys who have died at this reformatory in the past, of which there are a lot. The horror comes from how horrific this situation is. I would recommend checking content warnings if you need them, and I would also recommend reading the author's note at the end, which is where Tanana Reeve Due explains how this was based on real history. Next up I read Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones, which I gave 4 stars. I had never read anything by this author before, however I would definitely like to check out some of their full-length novels. This is only a short novella, I think it's around 150 pages, and all you need to know about the plot for this is that we're following a group of teenagers who decide to pull a prank in a movie theatre involving a mannequin. This was the perfect length in my opinion. I wouldn't have wanted it to be any longer or any shorter. I thought it did a great job of building this eerie feeling where I was anticipating what was going to happen next. I had this feeling like in the back of my mind where I knew what direction it was going to go in, because Stephen Graham Jones tells you in the beginning of the book there are clues as to what is going to happen, and I thought this had some really interesting commentary. It was very disturbing but very clever. I loved the stream of consciousness writing style where you're inside the mind of this main character. It is a slasher, so do bear that in mind if you are thinking about picking it up, but yeah, we'll definitely be checking out more books by Stephen Graham Jones. Next up I read Rewitched by Lucy Jane Wood, which is a cute and cozy witchy read. It does have a romance, however I would describe this more as a contemporary rather than like a fantasy romance or a romantasy. I keep seeing this recommended as a romantasy, and in my opinion it's not, because the romance doesn't take the forefront of the story. This is more about the main character's personal journey. So we're following Belladonna Blackthorn, who is a witch, and she is about to celebrate her 30th birthday when she receives a summons from her coven, because surprise, when witches turn 30 they are expected to go before their coven and prove that they are worthy of keeping their magic, and Belle has become very distanced from her magic. So this is really a story about her regaining her confidence and learning to believe in herself, and I really liked the overall message in this. I did also like the romance. It was only a hint, but I thought the main character had decent chemistry with the love interest. The pacing was a little bit slow in parts, which is why I gave this 4 stars. However, I would recommend this if you are looking for a book that has those 90s witchy vibes. I would also in particular recommend the audiobook because the narrator was fantastic. They have a northern accent and I thought that just really suited the tone of with the story. Next up, I read The Songbird and the Heart of Stone by Carissa Broadbent, which is the third book in the Crowns of Nyaxia world. This is also the start of a new duology. So the way the series is going to be structured is it's going to have 3 duologies. So we've already completed the first arc of the story, which starts in Serpent and the Wings of Night, one of my favourite books of the year so far. And this follows a side character from that first duology. The plot for this involves a journey through the underworld, and I loved this. This has restored my faith in fantasy romance or romantasy, because I've been reading a lot of romantasy this year that just hasn't quite been hitting the spot, and I think it's because I read Serpent and the Wings of Night and Ashes and the Star-Cursed King right at the start of the year, and everything else has just paled in comparison. But this was so much fun, even though it was also really intense. This does have a focus on religious trauma and deconstructing faith, which I thought was really interesting. It wasn't perfect. The stakes felt lower, even though the scope of the story has gotten bigger because the gods of this world are now becoming more entwined in the plot. But I was gripped the whole way through, and the ending put me through so many emotions. I had to give it 5 stars. One of my favourite romantasy books that I've read so far this year. I don't know whether I preferred this to the first duology. I think Serpent and the Wings of Night is still my favourite, but I enjoyed this almost as much. Next up, I read The Boyfriend by Frida McFadden, which I gave 3 stars. However, I think this is actually one of my favourite Frida McFadden books that I've read so far. I do enjoy picking up her books because they are the definition of popcorn thrillers. They're really fast-paced, really addictive, and they also, in my opinion, work really well as audiobooks because they have this simple conversational writing style. I find it really easy to get hooked on the audiobooks, so I listened to this in October and it was okay. It was exactly what I expected it to be. Actually, now that I think about it, it didn't start off well because the main character in this is so frustrating. She's in her 30s and she is single, but she is starting to become fed up of the never-ending cycle of dating where she meets someone on a dating app, she goes on a date and it doesn't go well, so she has to start all over again, and yeah, she's fed up. However, she does meet a guy at the start of this book who seems to be perfect. They start dating, everything seems to be going well until she begins to suspect that he might be a serial killer. The twist in this did get me. I didn't see it come in, and this keeps happening with Frida McFadden books is they end up going in directions that I don't expect, and quite often the reason I don't expect them is because they're not logical and they make no sense. I think if you're willing to suspend your disbelief and just be along for a fun time, then they are pretty enjoyable, and like I said, I gave this one 3 stars. Next up we have Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros, which I finally read and I did end up kind of enjoying. I had so many mixed feelings on this because I hated the writing. There was a lot of info dumping and there was some stuff that made no sense. Like there's a part, in fact it happened quite often, the main character would just randomly start thinking stuff to herself to do with the world building, and it was just so weird. Like there's one point where she is in mortal danger and she starts thinking to herself, okay, I'm going to calm myself down by reciting this history that I know about the world, and it was just so ridiculous. However, this was so much fun. It was so addictive, and it's made me realise why I've been struggling with romantasy this year. Even though I did enjoy this and I gave it 4 stars, this I think sparked a new trend in romantasy where there's clearly a market for people who want books that have the plotting and the pacing and the tropes of YA fantasy, but with a romance that has spice. There's nothing wrong with that. Like I said, there's clearly a big market for it. However, that is not the type of romance that I enjoy reading. What I'm looking for is adult fantasy combined with adult romance, and I think that has been why I've been struggling with a lot of recent romantasy releases. However, I enjoyed this. I love the school setting, the military school and the dragons. I thought it was really fun and I probably will pick up the sequel. Next up we have Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll, which I gave 5 stars. This is a literary historical crime novel. It's not a thriller, just to set expectations. It does have much slower pacing than a traditional thriller. However, I thought this was fantastic. It's set in the 1970s and it follows a couple of different characters. The first is Pamela, who is the president of her sorority when a man breaks in the middle of the night and kills 2 women and injures several others. So it's about about the trauma that she went through and how she is processing that. She is then approached by a woman called Tina, who is convinced that there's a link between what happened at this sorority and a woman called Ruth who went missing several years before. I loved the way that this challenged the whole narrative around serial killers and how they're portrayed in the media, how they're often labelled as smart and clever, and that's why they're able to get away with what they're doing, when actually maybe there are other reasons why they get away with what they do. It was so frustrating to read, but in a really intentional way, and I just thought this was incredible. I really appreciated everything that this had to say and how it really centred the women in this story. Even though I said earlier that it's not really a thriller, it does have these tense moments. It also has emotional moments, and it was dark in places. Again, recommend checking trigger warnings, but I really appreciated everything this had to say, and yeah, it was 5 stars. One of the easiest 5 stars that I've given this year. Next up we have Godkiller by Hannah Kaner, which I gave 3 stars. This was very forgettable in my opinion. It's set in this world that is kind of cool. It follows a few different characters who are all travelling to this one destination. So a few years before the start of the story there was this god war, and now it is illegal, or it's outlawed, to worship gods because that is how they gain their power. So following a few different characters who are travelling to the epicenter of this war because there's this young girl who has a god that's stuck to her, and they think that they'll find answers to this in this city because it's never been seen before. I can be okay with journey stories when there's something else keeping my attention. So if there's really good banter between the characters, or there's really good chemistry, not even romantic chemistry, I just want an interesting dynamic to keep my attention, and I don't think this really had that. The characters in my opinion were quite bland and the dialogue was just very flat. So yeah, while the world was interesting, there wasn't anything that I would highlight as being done spectacularly well. So I gave it 3 stars, and I'm still undecided on whether I'm going to continue the series. The final book that I read in October was The Ferryman by Justin Cronin, which I gave 4 stars. I thought this was a solid sci-fi novel that almost felt like a movie. In fact, the way that I'm going to pitch this to you, if you've ever seen The Truman Show with Jim Carrey, imagine you are Jim Carrey's character in The Truman Show and you live this peaceful, idyllic life, a very privileged life. However, something doesn't feel right. That is the vibe of this book. Essentially, you have these 3 islands, and the one island is where the privileged people live. You then have a second island where everyone else lives, and then there's a third island where the privileged people are sent once they reach the ends of their lives to be reborn as teenagers. Then they start their lives all over again and go through these cycles. However, they don't remember their life previously. The main character works for the government in the department that is responsible for getting people to the ferry that takes them to this third island. And yeah, I gave this 4 stars because there was a chunk in the middle that I found a little bit confusing, and I think it was deliberately meant to be confusing, but there were certain aspects that I don't think were necessary, and it did feel a little bit bloated. Also, there was some action scenes in the middle that I don't think were that gripping. The stakes never really felt that high. I'm not the biggest fan of action scenes anyway. However, I thought the ending was very clever. I liked the way that everything came together in the end, and I would recommend it if it sounds like your kind of thing. That does bring me to the end of this wrap up. So these are all of the physical books that I read in October, and then I also read quite a few ebooks and audiobooks. But yeah, let me know in the comments if you've read any of these and if you have any thoughts or feelings on them. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and click subscribe if you'd like to see more videos from me. But otherwise, I will see you next time. Bye.